The conversation around AI and jobs is just everywhere, but it feels like most of it is stuck on one question. Which jobs are going to get automated? Well, today we're going to dig into some new research that says, you know what? That's only half the story.
Right, so let's get into it. The real question we should be asking isn't just, can a robot do your job? It's, if your job gets disrupted, how well can you bounce back? And trust me, the answer is probably not what you're thinking. We've all seen the lists, right? These high-skill, white-collar jobs, the folks who work with their brains are supposedly first on the chopping block. And look, it's true that these jobs have a ton of AI exposure.
But it turns out that exposure by itself, it's a pretty terrible way to figure out who's actually in deep trouble. There's this other absolutely crucial piece of the puzzle that almost everyone is missing.
And that missing piece is a concept that researchers call adaptive capacity. Honestly, this one idea completely changes how we should be thinking about the real risks of AI.
So what is it exactly? Well, put simply, adaptive capacity is your financial and professional resilience. Think of it this way. It's not about whether you get knocked down by some big economic change, but how well equipped you are to get back up, dust yourself off, and find a new, good job.
The researchers actually broke this down into 4 key things. First up, you've got financial savings. That's your safety net, right? It's what gives you the breathing room to find the right next job, not just any job. Then there's age. The data is pretty clear that younger workers just tend to have an easier time finding new work. Next is geography. If you live in a big, dense city, there are just more doors to knock on. And finally, there's skill transferability. Are your skills super specific to one job, or are they more like a Swiss Army knife that you can use in a bunch of different roles?
Okay, so what happens when you take this idea, this new lens of adaptive capacity, and you actually apply it to the entire American workforce? Well, that's exactly what the researchers did, and the map they created is pretty fascinating.
They took data that covered something like 96% of all American workers, and they plotted every single one of them on a graph. On one axis, you have how exposed their job is to AI, and on the other axis, you have how much of that adaptive capacity they've got. And when you do that, you get 4 really distinct groups. Down in the bottom right, you've got the secure, low exposure, high adaptability. They're doing just fine. Top right, the well-positioned. Now these folks have high AI exposure, but they also have high adaptability. We'll come back to them. Bottom left, the insulated, low exposure, but also low capacity to adapt. And then top left. This is the group we really need to pay attention to, the vulnerable. They're facing high AI exposure with very little ability to adapt if things go south.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because when the researchers looked at who actually falls into these different boxes, the data tells a story that just completely flips the script on what we think we know about AI and jobs.
So remember that group we all thought was at risk, the software developers, the financial managers? Well, there are 26.5 million of them in those highly exposed jobs. But here's the kicker. They're also well-positioned. They make good money, they have savings, they have skills that are in demand. They're actually pretty well equipped to handle whatever comes their way. No, the real group to worry about, according to this study, is this much smaller group of 6.1 million workers. These are the people stuck in that vulnerable quadrant. They're getting hit with a double whammy. Their jobs are highly exposed to AI, and they have a really low ability to navigate losing that job. And here it is. This might be the most staggering, eye-opening finding in the entire report. Of those 6.1 million most vulnerable workers, a whopping 86% are women. Let that sink in. This isn't some broad, gender-neutral thing. The data is screaming that a very specific group of people is poised to bear the brunt of this change.
So this paints a totally different picture, doesn't it? The worker who is most at risk isn't some high-paid coder in Silicon Valley. It's much more likely to be someone in an administrative or a clerical job who has modest savings, whose skills are maybe harder to transfer, and who just has way fewer options if their job disappears.
And this isn't spread out evenly across the country either. This vulnerability is really concentrated in specific kinds of places, like college towns and state capitals. Think about cities like Springfield, Illinois, or Carson City, Nevada, places with a ton of administrative jobs that support these big government or university institutions.
Okay, so we have this incredibly clear picture of who is vulnerable and where they live. But hang on a second. This whole picture is built on one massive assumption, that the future is going to look pretty much like the past. But what if AI isn't just another bump in the road? What if this time it changes the entire game?
You see, the model kind of assumes that AI will be like a factory closing down in one town. It's a local shock, and people can eventually move into other, more stable jobs in the wider economy. But what if the AI reality is totally different? What if it puts pressure on entire categories of work, all at the same time? If the jobs of the secretary and the customer service rep and the insurance processor are all getting squeezed at once, where do they go? They can't just transition into each other's jobs.
And that really gets to the heart of the critique here. What good are your transferable skills if the entire category of work that uses those skills is shrinking across the board? It's a really profound question, and one that a model based on past data might not be able to answer.
So does that mean we should just toss this whole study in the bin? Absolutely not. Even with that huge question mark hanging over it, this research gives us something unbelievably valuable, especially for policymakers who have to act right now. It gives us a roadmap.
Think of it like a triage map in an emergency room. It might not tell us exactly what our economy will look like in 10 years, but it tells us, with startling clarity, who is going to be hit first by this disruption and who is going to need help the fastest.
The authors really put it perfectly. We can debate the long-term changes forever, but right now, what we do know is that this vulnerable group of workers will face that income shock first. They have the smallest safety net to fall back on. And this is key, because we know where they live, we can actually design policies to reach them and help them efficiently.
And that really leaves us with the final, urgent question. This isn't some abstract, far-off future we're talking about anymore. If this research is basically a fire alarm, showing us exactly where the fire is starting to burn, the question for all of us is, what are we going to do to get the fire trucks there in time?